If you were born between 1946 and 1964, you will remember the terror that our generation experienced as we were constantly warned against the nuclear holocaust and the dangers of communism. As a society, we were totally devoid of any knowledge of the lives of the people behind the Iron Curtain of the Eastern Bloc. Only those stories that the Politburo released to the public, and of the stories of those who had already defected to the West. What we did know was that long lines existed for food, housing, and the basic necessities we took for granted were considered luxuries in the countries in the shadow of the Soviet sphere. All that came to an end with the crumbling of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism and Marxism in 1989. But what we also discovered was that the Soviet Union experienced the same problems as the ones that we experienced in the West. And one more specifically, serial killers.
In the late afternoon, early evening of December 22nd, 1978, Svetlana Grenakova waited for a streetcar in the town of Shakti, Russia, to take her home. The day was very cold, and Svetlana looked for a distraction from the frigid weather. She noticed a short, plump girl standing just a short distance from her. The young girl, who Svetlana believed was only 10 years old, wore a red coat with her hood trimmed with black fur. Svetlana also noticed that the young girl also wore a woolen scarf and a brown rabbit fur cap. Svetlana took great care in noticing the young girl. Then her attention focused more on the man standing next to her. Svetlana noticed a tall man, gray-haired, in his 40s, wearing glasses and a long black overcoat and carrying a shopping bag. The young girl standing next to the middle-aged man did not appear to be with him, but paid attention to what he said to her in conversation. Svetlana then noticed the man walk away from the plump girl, and then she followed him, looking happy and content. As Svetlana's streetcar arrived, she watched them walk away and then lost sight of them. The young girl that Svetlana observed was 9-year-old Lena Zakatnova. From all descriptions, Lena was a vibrant, cheerful little girl who had been telling her friends that she met a man that was bringing her some imported chewing gum. The ruse of chewing gum worked, as the young girl walked with the older man to a secret house. When Lena and the middle-aged man reached the secret house, not really a house but a small shack, the man unlocked the door to the shanty, switched on the light, and led Lena into the shack. Instantaneous to her entry, the man shoved Lena to the floor and tore out her clothes, removing her coat and her panties. When the girl began to scream, the man shoved his forearm into her throat to muffle the sound of her screams. The middle-aged man exerted his whole body weight upon Lena's throat until her plump body went limp. Unconscious on the floor of the shack, with her eyes remaining open, this facet made the man feel very bizarre, so he used a scarf to cover her eyes. He began to defile her body, but appeared unable to achieve an erection and violated the private parts of the young girl's body. The middle-aged man believed that the vicious attack on a small child brought him to orgasm like nothing before. As he continued to fondle part of her body, Lena awoke from her unconsciousness, drawing breath through her damaged throat. Panicking that the young girl may identify him to authorities, the middle-aged man produced a knife from the bag he carried and brutally stabbed the young girl 3 times in the stomach. As she lay motionless, he picked her up and her belongings, carrying the body through an empty lot not too far from the Grushkeva River. The man made a few mistakes when trying to hide his crime. Blood dripped from the girl's wounds onto the doorstep, and he left the light on inside the shack. The middle-aged man threw Lena's body into the river along with her school bag, watching her as it drifted downstream. The middle-aged man turned to go home. What he didn't realize was when he put her body into the river, Lena was still alive. On the following day, Lena's body was discovered floating in the river. Svetlana Grankova went to the police and described the middle-aged man that she saw walking away with little Lena. After a police artist committed to portrait the description Svetlana gave him, the police immediately arrested a suspect named Alexander Krevenchenko, who had served 6 years of a 10-year sentence for the rape and murder of a 17-year-old girl in 1970. But at the time of his arrest, Krevenchenko wore no glasses and had never worn glasses. After Krevenchenko's arrest, and then during the questioning of local authorities, the sketch rendered by the police artist of the middle-aged man Svetlana saw with Lena before her alleged abduction circulated throughout the town. And when police showed the sketch to the principal of a local mining school, he stated that it resembled a man who teaches at the school that he administered at. That man's name was Andrei Chikatilo. The police thereafter warned the principal that he was not to tell anyone that he made an identification of Chikatilo. 2 detectives that discovered the shack noted they found droplets of blood on the steps of the shanty and also noticed the light left on inside that illuminated the small area of the vacant lot through the dark winter atmosphere. After inquiries to his neighbors, the authorities picked up Chikatilo after they learned that he owned the building near the river where they found the blood droplets. However, they soon released Chikatilo after his wife provided an alibi for him, saying that he had been with her the whole evening. Evidence against the middle-aged Chikatilo proved daunting, but authorities agreed that Krevenchenko made a better suspect. After obtaining a quote-unquote confession, the court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. Most citizens in the village of Shakti believed this to be too lenient for a man who had already served time for a rape and murder. A local judge decided to review the evidence against Krevenchenko and reissued a sentence of death. By the time the Soviet Union finally executed Krevenchenko in 1984 for the 1978 murder of Lena Zhanitovo, dozens more women and children fell victim to this brutal killer. Some citizens believed if law enforcement would have questioned why Chikatilo was not questioned further by the authorities, this indeed would have spared many lives from a deviant murderer. But Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo certainly exhibited traits of someone who would have stayed under the radar as a serial killer due to his lack of ambition and the events he experienced earlier in his life. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 6, 1936, in Lebolchne, Ukraine, a small farming village. As a member of Stalin's peasant class, Chikatilo knew very well the conditions of the time and the death and destruction through collectivization. In fact, families experiencing really hard times were said to eat sawdust bread and even domesticated animals. One time, when Chikatilo was 5 years old, his mother told him that his older brother, Stefan, had been kidnapped and was believed to have been eaten. This rendition deeply affected the young boy, and he often visualized how his older brother died. The Soviet Union drafted Chikatilo's father, Roman Chikatilo, into the Red Army during World War II, and he found himself captured as a prisoner of war. Chikatilo often ridiculed his father for allowing himself to be caught. Although Chikatilo's father was released from a German prisoner of war camp and then from a Russian camp for his classification of being an enemy of the state, Chikatilo, who had already become a die-hard communist by the age of 10 years old, by the time of his father's release, often scolded his father for having surrendered. As a child, Chikatilo became very studious and was considered a scholarly student. He had an effeminate manner, and classmates incessantly teased the young man. Also, because of Chikatilo's vision, he was very nearsighted, he feared that the teasing would continue and refused to wear his glasses, waiting nearly 20 years before getting his first pair of glasses. As he got older, Chikatilo's contemporaries ceased their teasing as he grew taller, stronger, and retained a lot of the material that he had read. At the age of 16, Chikatilo became his school's newspaper editor and political information officer, positions that allowed him to display his arrogance and power over the other students. Despite the positions of authority that he attained within his educational institution, Chikatilo still lacked social skills, especially when it came to the females around. At the age of 18, Chikatilo applied to Moscow University but failed the entrance exam and blamed his rejection from the law program on his father's war record. But also, at this time, his confidence in approaching the fairer sex became more prominent. Even though he showed some success with initial contact with women, Chikatilo often failed in the sex department because he could not maintain an erection during sexual activity. Because of this failure, Chikatilo found sexual solace in incessant masturbation. At this time, during his period of national service, Chikatilo forcefully tried to have sex with a woman who rejected all his advances. He learned that he could take whatever he wanted when overpowering his alleged conquests. Furthermore, the more she fought, the more excited Chikatilo became and eventually ejaculated into his pants. Only then did he release the woman. After completing his national service, Chikatilo moved to Russia, to a small town just north of Rostov, where he worked as a telephone engineer. After saving enough money, he moved his parents and his sister to his new home. A few years after moving his family, Chikatilo's sister introduced him to a young woman named Faina. A short courtship developed, and eventually Chikatilo and Faina were married in 1963. Subsequent to their marriage, Faina learned that Chikatilo was unable to consummate the marriage and had no real interest in sex with her. Eventually, Faina convinced her husband to have sex with her, and of this intercourse, the two welcomed a daughter, Lyudmila, in 1965, and again a boy, Yuri, born in 1969. In 1971, Chikatilo gained degrees in literature and Marxism-Leninism from a correspondence program. He then became a teacher at a local vocational school in Novoshashtinsk, Russia. Because of his shyness and inability to instill classroom management, Chikatilo's students made fun of the instructor, and his colleagues never took him seriously, referring to him as odd. Even though Chikatilo raced ridicule and teasing from both his colleagues and pupils, he later admitted that being around the children caused him great sexual arousal. This arousal later translated from voyeurism and sexual abuse of both female and male students. Chikatilo resigned and moved from teaching position to teaching position. At another school, Chikatilo found himself in charge of the boys' dormitory. In one incident, he tried to perform oral sex on a boy in the dorms, and some of the senior boys discovered what Chikatilo was trying to do and taught him a lesson not to try it again. As a result of the beating, Chikatilo took to carrying a knife with him wherever he went. Because of the Soviet system at the time, an indiscretion by a single teacher could reflect on the entire faculty, and therefore no one reported it to authorities. In 1978, Chikatilo moved his family to the town of Shakti. Not too long after the move settled, Chikatilo bought a small shack near the river where he lured little Lina Zakotnova. After repeating his offenses against students, the school where he worked relieved him of his teaching duties. Unable to find another teaching job, Chikatilo found a job as a supply clerk for the Rostov, a local complex company. His job description called for the extensive travel throughout the country to purchase supplies for his employer. This seemed like the perfect cover for Chikatilo to traverse the country looking for new victims. Larissa Tkachenko was a 17-year-old teenager who ran away from her home at a very early age. No stranger to sexual activity, Larissa entertained young soldiers and was not above exchanging sex for a meal and a place to stay. On September 3, 1981, while waiting at a bus stop outside of the Rostov Public Library, Chikatilo approached her very easily as he made her a similar offer for a meal in exchange for sex. Chikatilo then led the young girl into the woods and, refusing any restraint, began to tear at Larissa's clothing. As the young girl was used to impatient lovers, she fought the middle-aged man off as best she could. Chikatilo smashed Larissa about her head with his fists, forcing her to the ground. In order to muffle her screams, Chikatilo forced dirt into the girl's mouth as he strangled her to death. He then bit off one of her nipples and ejaculated over her corpse. After completed this perversion, Chikatilo danced with joy over the body, got rid of her clothes, and then placed branches over the body in a half-hearted attempt to conceal his deed. With the murder of his first victim, Lena Zakatnova. Chikatilo felt unsatisfied and longing to commit another murder. But with the killing of Tkachenka, Chikatilo was left with an appetite hard to satisfy. While in this frame of mind, on June 12, 1982, Chikatilo committed another murder when he traveled to the town of Zaplavskia, where he killed 13-year-old Luba Biuruk after he followed her from a bus stop. Chikatilo, when he realized the two were far from the main town, blitzed Biuruk from behind, and when he failed to physically rape the girl, he pulled a knife from his pocket and stabbed at her wildly, including gouging out her eyes. Because of the summer season, when authorities found her body, it had already decomposed to the point of almost skeletal remains. After the murder of Biuruk, Chikatilo murdered 6 more times within the year of 1982. Lyubov Voloboyeva, aged 14, on July 25th. On August 13th, Oleg Pazhidevyev, aged 9. On August 16th, Olga Kuprinya, aged 14. On September 8th, Irina Korobelnikovia, aged 19. On September 15th, Sergei Kuzmin, aged 15. And on December 11th, Olga Stelmakinyuk, aged 10, had gone to a piano lesson at a nearby conservatory. A local farmer found Olga's nude body in a rusted tractor tut and left her there, and because she was murdered in the winter, the body held a high degree of preservation. The pattern of the knife wounds was clearly discernible. Olga's skull and stomach had been pierced numerous times, as it appeared the killer reached a height of killing frenzy. The victim's organs had been moved around in the body cavity, and especially attacked the victim's eyes, lungs, and sexual organs. The killer also attacked Olga's eyes, a signature that Chikatilo consistently perpetuated upon his victims. 2 of the victims were young males, which caused detectives great confusion when they finally got around to recognizing some sort of pattern in the murders. Because no detectives in the Soviet Union held any experience as to serial murder, the fact that the powers that be refused to recognize that the Soviet bloc countries ever experienced what was termed a Western problem, authorities began looking for 2 separate killers. Further confusion ensued when 2 of the victims were found outside of the Rostov area. Even with the connection between the murders outside of the jurisdiction, authorities stated that no link existed between the murders. The assailant increased the frequency of his attacks, and authorities were dealing with a vicious, sexually motivated serial killer who left little or no evidence with which police could use to catch him, except for the semen left on numerous victims. Sometime after June 18, 1983, Chikatilo murdered Laura Sarkisian. Before the summer of 1983 ended, Chikatilo murdered 3 more times. Sometime in July, he murdered Irina Dunenkova, age 13, Ludmila Kushuba, later in July, age 24, and on August 9, 1983, Igor Gudkov, aged 7. Gudkov suffered a brutal defilement compared to some of the other victims. It seemed with this last murder, Chikatilo's attacks became viler and more sinister, and his enraged passion took over his demeanor. Also with this last murder, 13 children were butchered, of which 6 were found. The Central Moscow militia, now concerned in 1983 with the disappearances and the murdered children, and therefore sent a Major Mikhail Fetisov in an investigative team from Rostov in order to take over whatever investigation had been instituted. Major Fetisov examined the investigation thus far and reported to his superiors in Moscow that the local police bungled the investigation from the very beginning and acted with impunity, that Major Fetisov severely questioned their competence. The visiting lawman strongly believed that a single sex-crazed killer committed the murders thus far. Major Fetisov's conclusions were accepted with the reservation by his superiors, but those same commanders still would not accept that a serial killer was responsible for committing the murders.
The need for a more specialized unit became readily apparent with the intervention of the Moscow militia. Major Fedosov immediately assembled a squad of experienced investigators, including an intuitive, intelligent, and observant forensic analyst, Viktor Burakov, who also held a special talent in crime scene investigation. In addition to Major Fedosov and Burakov, the major selected his deputy commander, Vladimir Kolishnikov, a seasoned investigator who also held the same belief of his boss, that a serial killer operated in the area of Shakti and around the Rostov area. The powers that be gave the new unit its own office and retitled it Division of Especially Serious Crimes. Since most of the bodies had been discovered in wooded areas, these crimes were labeled the Forest Strip Killings. Because the Soviet Union spent more money for technology regarding defense and less on law enforcement, computers were not widely used, and information fell upon the handwritten cards for suspects and criminal files. Details of particular individuals questioned by authorities were placed upon index cards and then filed with the proper jurisdiction. One of the cards, Burakov noticed, held the name of Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, who was questioned but then released when his blood type did not match the samples from the crime scenes. Police therefore released him. After releasing Chikatilo, police picked up a likely suspect who had been lurking around the bus and train stations. The suspect, a man named Yuri Kalenik, age 19, who exhibited the IQ of a severely mentally challenged person, confessed to stealing a car with 4 other friends and then confessed to murdering 7 children. Even though Kalenik and his 4 friends were questioned about the murders, but could not provide any details only the killer or killers would know. As the murders tended to continue, the police believed they were dealing with a gang of imbeciles and dropped that line of inquiry, releasing the men to family members. Another theory that authorities explored demonstrated that the killer must be employed as a driver, able to cover huge distances through the course of his employment. Police interviewed over 150,000 people, and then the authorities dropped this inquiry as pointless. By September of 1984, Chikatilo was responsible for the murders of 19 more people within the year. It became obvious through the unit's cursory examination that the murderer suffered from some sort of psychopathy that caused his behavior to kill. The unit examined all records from mental health hospitals, searching for any individuals prone to violence and sexual crimes. The unit also perused criminal records as well, to check for known sexual offenders or any suspect that may have been questioned about such crimes in the past. This tedious task meant that each person flagged had to be interviewed, prove their whereabouts at the time of the known timelines surrounding the murders, and blood taken to see if it matched the semen from one of the victims, Sergei Markov. The medical examiner discovered semen in Markov's anus and determined that the killer had type AB blood, and if any of the researched suspects matched that type, authorities brought them in for questioning. Those that didn't were released. Because of the brutal nature of Chikatilo's crimes, the government refused to place any news about the murders in the newspaper. They feared that Western governments may read the foreign papers and see that the authorities, at least at the command level, demonstrated a modicum of incompetence. Detective Burakov believed that if the public would have known about Chikatilo's rampage, his victim tally would not have climbed as it did. On one of the victims, investigators discovered a single gray hair, and Chikatilo started removing the upper lips of his victims. This caused mystery amongst the investigators as there seemed to be no apparent psychopathy that could have defined his latest action, other than he started collecting souvenirs of his work. At this particular point, authorities noticed that Chikatilo's pace quickened. At first he murdered 6 victims a year. By the end of 1984, Chikatilo murdered 1 every 2 weeks, and some of them more frequent. Burakov and the other investigators hoped that he would make a mistake, but the unfortunate aspect is that they would have to wait until some innocent soul fell under his heavy hand. Other than the minuscule amounts of evidence so far, and the limitations of forensic examination at the time in the Soviet Union, very little went to identify the killer. As a result of the surveillance of bus stations, tram stations, and train depots yielded numerous suspects for questioning. 2 men, in particular, piqued the unit's interest. One would later become an informant, while the other turned out to be the man for which authorities searched. The Soviet Ministry of the Interior decided that the unit needed expansion, and therefore 200 more detectives, a task force of sorts, joined the hunt for the Rostov Ripper. Burakov then saw promotion to the head of this task force and now had the manpower to more closely scrutinize the vast amounts of leads the unit received during the investigation. This also allowed for some officers, both male and female, to work undercover at some of the train, tram, and bus stations to smoke the killer out. During one of the surveillance positions in a Rostov bus station, a detective spotted an older man who spoke to a female, and when he escorted her to her bus and she got on, he then turned, went back into the station, and immediately began conversing with another adolescent girl. Investigators believed this suspicious behavior and decided to question the man. The man they stopped was none other than Andrei Chikatilo. Chikatilo stated that he lived in Shakti but visited Rostov many times on business as a part of his employment as a supply clerk for a local company. When asked about why he talked to young adolescent girls, Chikatilo stated he once worked as a teacher and that he missed speaking with young people. The officer then let him go. On another occasion, the officer spotted Chikatilo speaking to a woman again and decided to follow him onto another bus. There, Chikatilo seemed very uneasy and was always twisting his head from one side to the other. After the officer caught Chikatilo soliciting a prostitute, who then performed oral sex on him while on the bus, the officer arrested him for indecent behavior in public. When investigators searched his bag, they found a jar of Vaseline, a long kitchen knife, a piece of rope, and a dirty towel. None of these implements had anything to do with his employment as a supply clerk. The officer brought Chikatilo to the station and a medical technician drew his blood, type A. Chikatilo was also a member in good standing within the Communist Party and had impeccable references. Investigators decided to hold him anyway, believing that if Chikatilo sat in a cell for a few days that his tongue would loosen. He did not admit to anything but the fact that he had a sexual weakness. Under pressure from the Central Committee, investigators released Chikatilo. Officers later arrested Chikatilo for thefts he committed at work, and he spent 3 months in prison. During that time, no murders were committed, but he did not match the blood type allegedly belonging to the killer. Since Burakov realized that he was, in fact, dealing with a serial killer, he decided to speak with a Russian murderer that could give him some insight into the assailant he pursued so relentlessly. Burakov sat down to interview Anatoly Slivko, the sadistic murderer of young boys who sat in a Russian prison serving time for his crimes. Slivko attributed his actions to inability to engage in a normal sexual relationship, including arousal and satisfaction. Burakov learned through Slivko that sexual murderers incessantly fantasize and operate within a certain set of self-imposed rules that constantly demand that their fantasies must be acted upon. Burakov learned something about appearances and posturing regarding serial killers. Slivko demonstrated that he had no remorse nor moral compass. Several hours after the interview, Russian authorities executed Slivko for his crimes. Burakov strongly believed that X was much like Slivko and had no moral compass and no respect for human life, if that human life prevents the murderer from achieving total sexual domination and satisfaction.
The body of a dead woman turned up in July 1985 in Rostov. Later identified as Natalia Poklastova, this victim's corpse had no defilements other than the repeated stabbings that demonstrated Chikatilo's handiwork. On August 18, 1985, the body of Irina Gulyayeva, aged 18, was found in another wooded area near Rostov, and she bore all the signs of a Chikatilo murder. The assailant buried her in a shallow grave, save for her hand that remained above the surface of the dirt. Burakov and the others of his squad wondered whether there existed other shallow graves where the killer may have secreted the remains of other victims. According to the knowledge of Russian authorities, there were no more bodies found throughout the rest of 1985. In 1986, after poring over the details of every case and frustrated with the elusiveness of the killer, Burakov suffered a nervous breakdown. Feeling weak and exhausted, he suffered from insomnia, and his superiors, who, surprisingly, were very compassionate with the star detective, gave him a short vacation. Although no murders occurred throughout the course of 1986 that the investigators were aware, Burakov again concentrated on the case following his release from a mental health facility. When he returned from the sojourn, Burakov approached his superiors with an idea of bringing in a psychiatrist to examine the behavior of the killer based upon the crime scene photos, the types of wounds to the victims, and any general characteristics that could be gleaned from all the evidence and documentation. Detective Burakov suggested that psychologists and sexual pathologists step forward from the Rostov Medical Institute to formulate some sort of profile so that authorities would know what to look for in this killer. Most of the specialists demurred because they claimed a lack of information from the crimes themselves in order to formulate an accurate profile. But one psychiatrist, Dr. Alexander Bukanovsky, stepped forward and offered to assist police as abnormal psychiatry was his specialty. Burakov allowed Dr. Bukanovsky to view all the crime scene reports and photographs. The alienist spent months poring over the material to portray some sort of profile on the individual who could do these things to other human beings. Dr. Bukanovsky produced a profile 65 pages in length and listed every deviation in human nature that he could examine with reference to this killer. When he finished his report, Dr. Bukanovsky, having worked with gay men, sexual dysfunction, necrophiles, and necrosadists, stated that this killer, which the doctor labeled as Killer X, was not psychotic due to the fact that he maintained control of his deeds, but exhibited traits of narcissism and arrogance, considering himself gifted, but not overly intelligent. Although not the creative type of killer, he planned each murder as he found his intended victim, and even though he murdered young boys, Dr. Bukanovsky considered the assailant to be heterosexual, and murdering and assaulting the young boys merely served as a vicarious surrogate. He needed to watch people die in order to receive the ultimate in gratification. The Ripper hit the victims in the head to incapacitate them, and the multiple stabbings were a way for him to enter them sexually. When murdering his victims, according to Dr. Bukanovsky, X sat astride them or squatted next to them, getting as close as possible. Where the cuts and slashes entered more deeply than others, the doctor stated these represented the height of his pleasure. X may masturbate after the victim has expired. Dr. Bukanovsky also sensed the interest in X removing the eyes of certain victims. In many cultures, the eyes are believed to be the windows to the soul, and that the lens records the last thing the victim sees before death. The doctor reasoned that perhaps X believed in this superstition and wanted to remain unidentified to continue his murdering. Cutting into the female sex organs allowed X to maintain control over his victim. He may keep the organs or eat them. Removing the sex organs of boys may have been a way that X tried to neutralize them to appear female. Dr. Bukanovsky stated that X may be approximately 5 foot 10 inches tall, between 45 and 50 years of age, size 10 shoe, and had a common blood type. Dr. Bukanovsky confirmed that some already thought the murderer exhibited characteristics of a sexual deviant. The alienist concluded that the killer suffered from some sort of sexual dysfunction and brutalized his victims to compensate for it. At the age with which the doctor assumed the age of X, this is the period when most sexual perversions are developed. X most likely had a difficult childhood. His fantasies were quite vivid, but in actuality, his sex life left a lot to be desired. And, if X were married, his wife certainly let him keep his own hours and did not interfere with his comings and goings. Because of the compulsion with regard to his murders, X may stop some time, but only temporarily if he sensed close to being captured. But X's killing certainly would continue either until he died or authorities captured him. Furthermore, and finally, the doctor hypothesized that X may be controlled or triggered through the barometric pressure, most specifically when the barometer may have dropped. Although there may have been other stressors at home or work, Dr. Buchanovsky believed that only one has to look at the time of the week when the murders occurred. Most of the killings occurred in midweek, Tuesday through Thursday. Even though, at the time, Burakov believed that nothing in Dr. Buchanovsky's profile contained anything practical to find the murderer, the detective called the doctor once they had a suspect in custody to apply parts of his profile to the life of the suspect. Surprisingly, to Burakov, the good doctor arrived on point regarding the killer's behavior. From the spring of 1987 until early fall, the killer went back to work. On May 16, 1987, Chikatilo murdered 13-year-old Oleg Marenkov, but the boy's body would not be found until after Chikatilo's arrest some 3 years later. On July 30th, the father of Oven Bilovetsky found his son's body in the woods adjacent to the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, and Chikatilo lured a 16-year-old boy named Yuri Tereshinuk from a train near Leningrad, killing the boy and then leaving his body in some nearby woods. The following year, a nude female body was found near the grounds of a metal factory near the Krasny station on April 6th. Investigators discovered that the female had her hands bound behind her back and multiple stab wounds all over her body. The tip of her nose had been sliced off, and the killer crushed her skull. The unidentified woman had not been killed in the woods, and the only evidence the police located at the scene happened to be a large footprint. The body displayed no signs of sexual intrusion. Burakov wondered whether he should consider the most recent discovery to be included with the rest of the murders so far. Speculation arose as to whether the killer stopped all of a sudden until, on May 17, 1988, the body of a 9-year-old boy was discovered near the train station in Ilovaisk, Ukraine. The boy had been missing for 2 days, and authorities identified him fairly quickly as being Alexei Voronko. A classmate of the young boy noted to law enforcement that he witnessed Alexei walking with a middle-aged man who had gold teeth, a mustache, and a sports bag. The fact that the middle-aged man had gold teeth could narrow down the list of suspects due to the fact that no one in that area could afford gold crowns. When the medical examiner performed the autopsy on Alexei, he noted that the boy had been sodomized and his orifices filled with dirt. The young boy also had several knife wounds about his body and skull, and his penis had been removed. Near the end of the year, the Ministry of Health made an unusual statement by saying it had been a mistake to assume that typing blood in secretions was an accurate match to blood types. There were rare paradoxical cases in which they did not match. Burakov then believed that certain suspects that were eliminated because of their blood type could have, quite possibly, been the murderer. The idea that semen samples would have to be retaken to match the samples the killer already left at some of the crime scenes seemed daunting to Burakov and made it seem as though the investigation would have to start from square one. On July 14, 1988, Chikatilo murdered Evgeny Muratov while on a trip to Donashos. Police would not find the boy's body until April 10, 1989. At the time of the discovery, his remains decomposed considerably. On March 1, 1989, authorities discovered the body of 16-year-old Tatiana Raishoza, a runaway from Krasny Sulin. Chikatilo later stated that he killed this young girl in his daughter's apartment and then dismembered her there. Officers and undercover detectives working the stations failed to notice whether any middle-aged men accompanied children or young women. A ticket clerk, however, remembered seeing a middle-aged man lurking around the train stations around the time that Tatiana disappeared. The ticket clerk remembered the man because he tried to lure her son from the platform into the woods. The police located the man, but later cleared him. On May 11, 1989, a young boy aged 8 disappeared. The authorities later identified the youth as Alexander Dyankanov. He would be found 2 months later by the side of the road where his body had been stabbed and his genitals mutilated. Alexander had just celebrated his 8th birthday. Chikatilo changed his habits somewhat from leaving the previous victims in the woods, where Alexander was found on the side of the road, in the open. Authorities hoped that the killer was now becoming more careless in his dumping methods. This placed authorities on alert that the killer may have noticed all the surveillance occurring at the train stations and, as a result, changed the way he chose his victims. On June 20th, 1989, Chikatilo murdered Alexei Moiseyev, a little boy aged 10. Chikatilo later confessed that he took him from a beach into the forest. On August 19, 1989, Chikatilo lured a young woman off of a bus and murdered her near the village of Rostov. Helena Varga, aged 19, had a child of her own and wound up being Chikatilo's 44th victim to date. On August 28, 1989, Alexei Kobatov, aged 10, encountered a middle-aged man outside of a theater in Shakhty. This was the last time anyone saw the young boy again. When Chikatilo finished with the boy's body, he buried it in a nearby cemetery. No more murders were reported until the following year, when news arrived that an 11-year-old boy, Andrei Kravchenko, was abducted off the streets of Shakhty on January 14, 1990, and his dismembered and emasculated body was found on February 19, 1990. On March 7, 1990, the body of Yaroslav Makarov, aged 10, was found the following day after he was reported missing from a local train station after being truant to school. The medical examiner noted that Taroslav was missing his tongue and his sexual organs. On April 4, 1990, Lyubov Zayeva, aged 31, was lured off a train heading from Novocherkassk to Shakhty at the Donishlo station. It seemed that Chikatilo may have sensed that his apprehension was near because he quickened the pace of his killings. On July 28, 1990, Chikatilo lured a 13-year-old boy named Viktor Petrov from the train station at Rostov-Glavny, where he stayed with his family. Authorities found the boy's body at the Botanical Gardens, badly mutilated, and just a few yards away from where Yaroslav Markov had been found on March 8th. Because of the new perestroika, or restructuring of the Soviet system, the press clamored to find the killer, and pressure was brought to bear on the authorities to do so. The commanders in Moscow put a great deal of pressure on their underlings to find the killer, or they would be fired from their positions. People all over the nation acted desperately to find the murderer. As desperate as they had become to find this murderer of young people, it still did not deter Chikatilo from continuing his bloody rampage. On August 28, 1990, the murderer showed boldness when he abducted an 11-year-old Ivan Fomin from a public beach when the young boy went into the bushes to change. Chikatilo struck, stabbing the boy 42 times and then castrating him. Drawing on the manner in which Chikatilo seemed to be selecting his victims, Burakov chose a different course of action. He would select the most likely stations and then make surveillance very obvious in the others. Burakov wanted to project the image that the surveillance areas with plainclothes police officers would appear safe to the killer. What Burakov saw was to force the killer to act in a particular place, and in those places, officers stationed there would record the names of those men who acted suspicious and were questioned. Furthermore, Burakov placed men dressed as farmers adjacent to the woods and fields that surrounded train stations. It seemed an extravagant undertaking, but it had to be done if the killer was going to be captured anytime soon. Because the Donlisko station saw two of the victims lured from there, Burakov believed it to be a great place to start. But even before Burakov could enact his most recent plan, Chikatilo abducted someone else from that exact station. On October 16, 1990, Vadim Gromov, age 16, met Chikatilo in the train station as he headed to Taganrog. The murderer easily lured the young man into the woods, where he stabbed him repeatedly, over 27 times. Chikatilo then removed the victim's tongue, his testicles, and one eye. Vadim was an ideal victim for Chikatilo, as the boy was mentally challenged, and for entertainment, the teenager often rode the Elektrika, the electric slow-moving train. No one saw him exit with anyone. Burakov believed that if the plan to capture the killer had been allowed implementation sometime earlier, the killer could have been caught long before. This drove Burakov to despair, and many observing the dogged detective believed he would suffer another nervous breakdown before the murderer could be caught. Especially during the depths of this second round of depression and the plan in place, Chikatilo struck again. On October 30th, 1990, 16-year-old Viktor Tishenko, a rather athletic and strong youth, went to the Shakti station to pick up some train tickets for his family. There, he met Chikatilo, who enticed the young man into the woods. When Chikatilo tried to subdue the young man, he fought hard, biting the attacker's finger and breaking it before the assailant managed to gain the upper hand in the fight and stab Tishenko enough to weaken the boy and get him on the ground. Authorities later discovered Tishenko's battered and mutilated body 2 miles south of the station in the woods. 2 previous victims, Svetlana and Tatiana Petrosian, were found in almost the exact spot 6 years before. Burakov hoped this would be the last murder, as he set the trap where all the killer had to do was walk into it. But again, Chikatilo avoided any detection whatsoever when on November 6, 1990, he found a homeless woman named Svetlana Korostik, aged 22, whom he brought into the woods where he beat, sliced her open, and cut off part of her tongue. No witnesses saw her with anyone who would have matched the killer's description. In continuing the investigations around the stations, one name stood out as to someone who was questioned before, but because of the semen blood anomaly and the fact that he was a Communist Party member, he had to be released. Burakov knew the lab work was anything but competent, but when he heard this name again as having been at the train station the same time that Korostik had disappeared, his gut told him that Andrei Chikatilo was their killer all along. Chikatilo was spotted at the train station where Korostik had disappeared, and several witnesses stated they saw him walking out of the woods and washing his hands at a pump. At the time the witnesses observed this, they also noticed that he had a red smear on his cheek and twigs clung to the back of his coat. One of the undercover officers spotted Chikatilo and made inquiries, which he promptly recorded. When Burakov learned of Chikatilo and the incident at the train station, he placed the middle-aged man under strict surveillance. Burakov subsequently learned that all of Chikatilo's business trips coincided with the murders that took place within the time period in which the investigations took place, including the one in Moscow. He saw himself fired from other positions as a supply clerk as he failed to return from these trips with the supplies. Additionally, during the time of his incarceration in 1984, no murders occurred. Burakov believed this to be no coincidence. He also learned that the former teacher lost his position due to his proclivity to abuse children. As a consequence of his incarceration, Chikatilo lost his good standing with the Communist Party and summarily was kicked out of the organization. Although the evidence on Chikatilo proved circumstantial, Burakov and his superiors realized they needed him to confess. When officers reported back regarding the surveillance, they saw an ordinary man doing nothing unusual. Finally, on November 20th, 1990, 3 officers dressed in street clothes brought Chikatilo in for interrogation. They noted that he was married, had 2 children, was an intellectual of sorts, and his mouth contained an overabundance of gold teeth, as one witness stated to authorities. Famous government attorney Isa Kostyev handled the initial phases of the interrogation. Although Kostyev had been characterized as a mean interrogator, he decided that in order to get a murderer like Chikatilo to confess, he would have to maintain an even tone without anger and utilize compassion. The experienced interrogator wanted the room to show no signs of abundance and ordered that the interrogation room be stripped of everything except a table, 2 chairs, and a safe that would hint at the evidence that the authorities had against Chikatilo. Kostyev noticed when Chikatilo first entered the room the day subsequent to his arrest that he walked with a shuffling gait, much like an elderly person. He also noticed that the suspect murderer was tall, with a long neck, sloping shoulders, and oversized glasses. To Kostyev, he knew the shuffling was a ruse and viewed Chikatilo as a calculating killer with plenty of strength and energy he called upon to commit his crimes. Kostyev viewed the suspect as easy to break, as he strove to get inside Chikatilo's head, figure out his logic, and then extract a confession. Killers love to brag about their exploits once they have been apprehended, and Kostyev believed the subject now sitting before him was no exception. Kostyev knew he only had 10 days to get the confession from Chikatilo, or, under Russian law, they would have to release the suspect. Kostyev started right away by telling Chikatilo that the authorities had made a mistake, just like they had in 1984 when they first investigated Chikatilo. The suspect denied having been at the train station on November 6th and did not know why witnesses reported his presence there at the time. Kostyev knew Chikatilo lied and let him know that. For the first day, the interrogation ended. On the following day, November 22, 1990, Chikatilo waived his right to counsel and then wrote a 3-page statement that he spoke about his sexual perversion and his sexual weakness. What Kostyev hoped would be a full confession turned out to be a pleading to lesser crimes other than murder. Chikatilo admitted in a longer essay that he observed the children at the train stations and took interest in how the homeless beggars always preyed on these children. He also admitted to his sexual impotency, and the essay appeared to be an indirect confession where Chikatilo pointed to other suspects other than himself and how he often thought about suicide. However, he never admitted to murdering anyone, especially children. After perusing the confession, Kostyev stated to Chikatilo that his only hope was to confess fully to all the murders and that a court would appoint a psychiatrist to attest to his insanity where he could be treated instead of incarcerated. Later attestations brought Chikatilo to admit to fondling female students and admissions that he lost all self-control when it came to being around children. In subsequent essays written within the 10 days, Chikatilo revealed no details about the murders. However, after a medical examination took place, the lab technicians discovered that Chikatilo's blood type was A, but his semen allegedly had a very weak B antigen, thus making it appear that his blood type registered as AB, though it wasn't. This was the paradoxical case that technicians mentioned earlier in the investigation. Other hematologists and DNA experts scoffed at the assertion even years after the case was solved. After a few days of interrogation, Burakov and others became nervous due to the fact that there were not that many days left with which to charge Chikatilo with the murders on the evidence they possessed, and still there was no confession. Burakov heard from an informant in Chikatilo's cell that the interrogation techniques were not working because the suspect became very defensive when asked about the murders, almost as if he wanted to guard his methods so that other killers would not experience the satisfaction that he had in committing them. Kostyev went so far as to bring in photographers to take pictures of Chikatilo in trying to make the suspect believe there were witnesses that were going to testify against him once these witnesses identified Chikatilo from the photographs. Still, the suspect refused to confess fully. Kostyev steadily approached the 10th day with virtually nothing to show. Burakov suggested bringing in another interrogator, someone who may know the criminal mind more than the police. Burakov suggested bringing in Dr. Bukanovsky, who wrote the original profile on the person he named Killer X. Kostyev reluctantly agreed. On the 10th day of questioning, Dr. Bukanovsky entered the interrogation room, sat down, and introduced himself to Chikatilo. The doctor only agreed to this type of interrogation out of professional curiosity and not for anything to do at trial. However, once Dr. Bukanovsky sat down and began reading the report he wrote based upon the evidence collected at the time, along with his viewing of the crime scene photos, the doctor understood that he described in his initial assessment the type of man who could commit these murders in such a brutal fashion. It became readily obvious through the many hours of Dr. Bukanovsky's reading of his report to Chikatilo that the accused murderer listened intently to every word of the report as the doctor read it and became visibly shaken with the assessment. When Dr. Bukanovsky walked out of the interrogation room after almost 13 hours, he turned to the investigators and said that the suspect was ready to confess. Kostyev then prepared a statement that Chikatilo then signed, admitting to 36 murders. At the time, law enforcement did not know the exact number of victims that Chikatilo had murdered. Chikatilo admitted that he wanted to tell about his life and what eventually led him to the crimes he committed. When he could not perform sexually on the victim, he used his knife as a substitute. Chikatilo then answered the question about the blindfolding and the taking of the eyes. He did not want the last image that authorities could see in the victim's eyes to have been his face. He also stated that he just did not like the victims looking at him. Chikatilo also told of his cannibalism when he accosted then murdered a young beggar girl in the woods, using his teeth to bite off her nipple and then swallowing it. Chikatilo went into the details of all the 36 murders that Kostyev charged the suspect in committing. Sometimes he acted as a predator, and other times the victims were mere victims of opportunity. Chikatilo remarked that the stabbings were often substitutes for sexual intercourse. He answered why, with the male victims, that he would cut out their tongues or their penises, although he did admit that he took revenge against life itself when removing the genitals of his victims. In the end, Chikatilo confessed to more than 56 murders, although the authorities could only corroborate 53. Burakov actually believed there could have been more. Now, the authorities had enough evidence to try Chikatilo for the murders. In order to secure the defendant and make sure that no vigilantes would hurt him or end his life before the trial, or the state had a chance to carry out any sentence, the court constructed a steel cage with which Chikatilo was consigned to sit in during the entire trial, which began on April 14, 1992, with 225 volumes of evidence against and about Andrei Chikatilo. Family members of the murder victims packed the courtroom and screamed at the defendant, who simply just ignored them. Oftentimes, during the proceedings, Chikatilo acted as though he was unaware of his surroundings in an attempt to bring forth a plea of insanity. But several psychiatrists deemed him sane enough to face justice. Also, Chikatilo knew what the sentence the court intended to impose and yelled at the judge several times. After witnesses called to the stand testified, evidence presented, including the defendant's confession, the judge took 2 months to reach a verdict, and on October 14, 1992, the judge found Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo guilty of child molestation, 4 counts, and 52 counts of murder. After hearing the verdict, Chikatilo screamed at the court and began a conniption fit within the cage where he demanded to see the corpses. The judge sentenced Chikatilo to execution for his crimes. Guards escorted the now convicted serial killer back to his cell to await the results of a summary appeal. On February 14, 1994, the day when his appeal was denied, guards led Chikatilo to a soundproof room within the prison and shot him behind the right ear, executed as deemed his sentence by the court. The aftermath of the Andrei Chikatilo trial drew greater attention to serial killers and made this one more infamous than ever within the world culture. Because of Dr. Bukhanovsky's assessment of the serial killer, Russian authorities were better prepared in dealing with what once was thought to be a Western problem. In 1999, Newsweek published a story that since the execution of Andrei Chikatilo, serial killers seemed to run amok in the area of Rostov, Russia, where it had been renamed the serial killer capital of the world. With killers such as Onoprienko, whom we've profiled here on True Crime Man's Dark Imagination, and others such as Popkov, it would appear that Rostov is a hotspot for the serial killer mentality. As far as being the serial killer capital of the world, we still may need to look toward the United States to hold that title. Dr. Bukhanovsky later opened a clinic where he claimed to have a cure for violent psychopaths. Some of the criminals that the doctor got to confess to their crimes stated that he had a way of making people tell their most closely guarded secrets. As for the man who once held the title of the most famous detective on the planet, Viktor Bukharov, after capturing Chikatilo, his superiors promoted him to the rank of colonel, and his methods are still studied today. Sadly, he died in 2018. Until next time.